I want to read you something that I came across a little while ago when I was researching my last book. I don't want to tell you who wrote it or where it comes from at first, because I think it's even more brilliant and more interesting if you find that out after you hear it. The story is about a young man who wastes his family fortune because he's too lazy to do any real work. And when the situation becomes really bleak, he decides he's going to be a merchant and sell silk in the capital. He leaves his wife behind, but he promises he'll be back in the autumn. He does really well, but while he's gone, war breaks out. He tries to get home, but the roads are all blocked, and he's robbed. And because he's not that great of a guy anyway, he gives up and stays away for years. But finally, things start to change. So, here we go. In 1461, the struggle between the Hatakeyama brothers in the province of Kawachi showed no sign of ending, and the turmoil approached the capital. What's more, corpses piled up in the streets as an epidemic swept through the city in the spring. Thinking that a cosmic epoch must be coming to an end, the people lamented the impermanence of all things. Katsushiro pondered his situation. Katsushiro is the main character of the story. Reduced to this pointless existence, how long should I drag out my life, and for what, lingering in this distant land, depending on the generosity of people with whom I have no ties of blood? It is my own faithless heart that has let me pass long years and months in a field overgrown with the grass of forgetfulness, unmindful even of the fate of her I left at home. Even as she is no longer of this world and has gone to the land of the dead, I would seek out her remains and construct a burial mound. Thus he related his thoughts to those around him, and during a break in the rains of the 5th month, said farewell. Travelling for more than 10 days, he arrived at his village. Although the sun had already sunk in the west, and the rain clouds were so dark they seemed about to burst, he doubted he could lose his way, having lived for so long in the village, and so he pushed through the fields of summer. But the jointed bridge of old had fallen into the rapids, so that there could be no sound of a horse's hooves. He could not find the old paths because the farmland had been abandoned to grow wild, and the houses that used to stand there were gone. Scattered here and there, a few remaining houses appeared to be inhabited, but they bore no resemblance to those in former days. Which is the house I lived in? He wondered, standing in confusion, when about 40 yards away he saw, by the light of stars peeking through the clouds, a towering pine that had been riven by lightning. "The tree that marks the eaves of my house!" he cried, and joyfully moved forwards. The house was unchanged, and appeared to be occupied. The lamplight glimmered through a gap in the old door. Does someone else live here now? Or is she still alive? His heart pounding, he approached the entrance and cleared his throat. Someone inside heard immediately and asked, "Who's there?" He recognised his wife's voice, though greatly aged. Terrified that he might be dreaming, he said, "I've come back. How strange that you should still be living here alone, unchanged in this reed-choked moor." Recognising his voice, she quickly opened the door. Her skin was dark with grime, her eyes were sunken, and long strands of hair fell loose down her back. He could not believe that she was the same person. Seeing her husband, she burst into wordless tears. Stunned, Katsushiro could say nothing for a long time. Finally he spoke, but he rambled on, tediously repeating himself. Drying her tears, his wife said, "After I bid you farewell, the world took a dreadful turn, even before the arrival of the autumn I relied on, and the villagers abandoned their houses and set out to sea, or hid in the mountains. Most of the few who remained had hearts of tigers or wolves, and sought, I suppose, to take advantage of me now that I was alone, and I endured many bitter experiences. The brilliance of the Milky Way heralded the autumn, but you did not return. I waited through the winter, I greeted the new year, and still there was no word. Now I wanted to go to you in the capital, but I knew a woman could not hope to pass the sealed barrier gates where even men were turned away. And so, with the pine at the eaves, I waited vainly in this house, foxes and owls my companions until today. I am happy now that my long resentment has been dispelled. No one else can know the resentment of one who dies of longing, waiting for another to come. With this, she began to sob again. The night is short, he said, comforting her, and they lay down together. He slept soundly, weary from his long journey, and cooled through the night as the paper in the window sipped the pine breeze. When the sky brightened in the 5th watch of the night, the 5th watch is about 4 a.m, he felt chilly, though still in the world of dreams, and groped for the quilt that must have slipped off. A rustling sound wakened him. Feeling something cold dripping on his face, he opened his eyes, thinking that rain was seeping in. The roof had been torn off by the wind, and he could see the waning moon lingering dimly in the sky. The house had lost its shutters. Reeds and plumed grasses grew tall through gaps in the decaying floorboards, and the morning dew dripped from them, saturating his sleeves. The walls were draped with ivy and arrowroot. The garden was buried in creepers. Even though fall had not come yet, the house was a wild autumn moor. And where, come to think of it, had his wife gone who had been lying with him? She was nowhere in sight. Perhaps this was the doing of a fox. But the house, though dilapidated in the extreme, was certainly the one he had used to live in. From the spacious inner rooms to the rice storehouse beyond, it still retained the form that he had favoured. Dumbfounded, he felt as though he had lost his footing, but then he considered carefully. Since the house had become the dwelling place of foxes and raccoon dogs, a wild moor, perhaps a spirit had appeared before him in the form of his wife, or had her ghost, longing for him, come back and communed with him. It was just as he had feared. This is such a familiar ghost story, isn't it? The Gothic notion of the wild moor and the tumble-down house, the ghost inside, these are all things that we have heard before. But the reason I think this story is so interesting as a Western reader is its provenance and its date. As you could probably tell from the character names and the place names, this is a Japanese story. It's from 1776, from Akinari Ueda's gorgeous collection, Ugetsu Monogatari, which means Tales of the Moon and the Rain. These stories are full of ghosts, whether they're the ghosts of abandoned places like this one, or samurai determined to keep a promise even after death. There are monsters too, and it sounds just like it must be Gothic, just as English readers understand the idea, but of course it isn't related to the English Gothic at all, even though Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto is published almost at the same time, 6,000 miles away. Walpole and Ueda had no overlap. Japan was a closed country in this period, and there were very, very few Europeans there at the time. There's a great cameo in Gulliver's Travels where Gulliver lands there briefly, but landing there briefly really was about all a foreigner could do at this stage. Certainly, Akinari Ueda was not reading English novels. Japan actually got this vogue for the deeply creepy well before the English-speaking world did. Ueda is writing in an already popular genre called kaidanshu, which are books that narrate the strange and the weird. It had been going strong for at least 100 years before he arrived on the scene. But Ugetsu Monogatari and The Castle of Otranto are cracking books to compare. They're so similar. Walpole had his sinister monks at Otranto. Ueda has an insane and possibly necrophiliac monk in the mountains in one of his stories. Both books hinge almost identically on spooky landscapes and crumbling edifices. These are two wonderfully parallel literary movements, but they evolved quite separately. One of the things that I think Ueda and Walpole prove if you take them together is that humans are basically all the same, and we love being scared half to death. If you'd like to read more, you can get Ueda's work in English. The best translation I've found is called Tales of Moonlight and Rain by Anthony Chambers. For anyone who wants to get even further into Japanese writing, this story is actually based on another far older snippet from The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. If you'd like to see where the Japanese Gothic goes after this, you absolutely must have a look at Ryosuke Akusugawa's short stories.